So our next speaker is Andrew Butler, and we're just going to get rolling because time is short. So turn it over to you, Andrew.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. I can't think of a better way to spend a rainy day than learning about the ecology of the Monadnock region. I'm a PhD student at the University of New Hampshire, and I'm going to be presenting some work that I'm co-leading along with our great collaborators at New Hampshire Fish and Game on evaluating whether we can predict carnivore abundance across the whole state of New Hampshire. And I'll present some preliminary results from the Monadnock region and talk about kind of where we're going with the data we've collected so far. So one thing it's good to start with why we would want to do this. Why would we want to be able to predict carnivore abundance and density? And we're lucky in New Hampshire to live with a pretty wide diversity of carnivore species, some aquatic, some terrestrial, some that are pretty rare, and some that are pretty abundant. And these species have important cultural, economic, and ecological roles, from seed dispersal and predation on small mammals to roles culturally through trapping community, and have a long history of use by indigenous cultures. And given all these important values, it's important for managers to have really accurate information on the distribution and abundance of these species. So I want to take a poll and raise your hand if you can see any animal in this picture. There's a few. That's good. So there's a bobcat here on the right in this picture from a trail camera. And this is really meant to highlight that while accurate information on their abundance distribution is crucial, it's incredibly hard to collect this information on these species. They're cryptic and often nocturnal and live at low densities, which makes monitoring them quite difficult. Unlike, say, a wild turkey, where if you're driving along Route 9, you might see a couple flocks of a dozen turkeys. You probably won't see a group of a dozen bobcats. And if you ever have, we can talk at lunch. So there have been some, and this I would say is not, a problem specific to New Hampshire. All state agencies have this problem of how to monitor and make management decisions for these species. In some ways that this has been done before is by usually looking for sign of these species, scent stations, winter track surveys, hair snares. And the most common one that a lot of state agencies use are the trappers reports. And these are a requirement of having a trapping license and are great because they're free information that trappers have to report, so you can get information on the distribution of where species are trapped, and they create an index of abundance, usually the number of individuals per 100 trapping nights. However, in the recent years, there have been some biases that people have found in studying these, that the index may not be directly related to the abundance of the species, but can be affected by things such as the cost of gas prices, winter severity. There's a declining number of trappers across the United States. Trappers don't necessarily trap randomly on the landscape. And so it's, would be useful for managers to have a kind of independent means of estimating their abundance across the landscape. And I presented some information here from the past 20 years from trappers reports, and you can get this from the Fish and Game website, just to highlight kind of what this data looks like. If we look at the red fox, the index would, show that they've decreased over 15 years, but then increased in the past 5 years, and we kind of don't really know. Are these true patterns? Would an increase of 1 individual per 100 trap nights to 2 really indicate that the population's doubled? So emerging kind of in the past few years is the use of trail cameras. And trail cameras used to be pretty clunky. You'd have to go out and they'd be film cameras, and you'd only maybe get a couple of dozen pictures. But now you can get thousands of pictures on a trail camera, and the batteries might last a year or two. However, unlike trapping reports, they're quite expensive. They can be expensive, and given the number of pictures that they collect, processing this data can be labor intensive. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And there's some new analytical methods that have been developed to deal with the number of pictures and kind of the data you get, whether an individual's there or not. However, not all these methods have been tested across all species. So that's where this project comes in. We started this collaboration this year with Fish and Game. It's going to be a 3-year study where we're going to try to see if trail cameras are useful for estimating carnivore occurrence, relative abundance, and density, and learn more about their natural history, look at some habitat relationships, and compare our estimates of density with those from the trapping reports. So this summer, we set up over 300 trail cameras across the state, everywhere from Pittsburgh down to the Massachusetts border, the top of Mount Washington. And we had these arrays set up, represented by these grids where we have 8 to 10 cameras. And we set these up in a stratified random design, trying to highlight and capture some of the broad landscape characteristics that we think might influence carnivore abundance. And so we check these twice a year in fall and spring, and we're actually checking them right now. And I was just out in Stoddard a couple weeks ago checking the cameras, so the information I'll present is pretty fresh off the press. So locally, here we are in Keene and the red star, and I kind of highlight kind of the local regional cameras. We work with a lot of landowners to have continued access to these sites, and they're likely to work with, different landowners such as the Harris Center and these other partners, and it takes a lot of time to set these up and check them each year, so we're always kind of looking for volunteers. If you want to adopt a bunch of cameras to check, we'd love to work with you. So as I said, we just started checking these cameras, so it's really exciting for us to get these SD cards from the cameras and see what we are detecting or not detecting, and just looking at the initial results of what's around. And so the next slide will show kind of the number of pictures we got for each carnivore species in the region from cameras that were out from June through the end of October. So the blue bars on this graph represent the number of total pictures of each species and is on the left-hand y-axis, and the green is the number of cameras that each species was detected at. We can kind of start seeing just some initial interesting patterns of, coyotes and bobcats being pretty widespread, whereas we didn't capture very many foxes. But things like raccoon were kind of moderately distributed across the area, whereas we didn't find any skunks. And interesting thing is we only had Fisher at one camera, which was kind of interesting given that we kind of did a pilot study in southeastern part of the state, and they seem to be fairly abundant. So I'll kind of go through just a few examples of how this information looks on the landscape. So for the bobcat here, we have each blue circle represents where a camera was, and the bigger the circle, the more pictures we got at that site, and the smaller circle was fewer. And we can see that, again, this fairly widespread distribution across the area, which seems to be with a seeming kind of hotspot in Hancock, and then down near Sharon. And this is, interesting to have pretty wide distribution, and this kind of some more pictures here and less there I'll show is really what is interesting to us and will be useful in a few slides I'll show you. But moving on to a coyote, which we also found to be widespread as well. As you might expect, coyotes seem to be everywhere these days. Kind of matches what we might anticipate. And then for the raccoon, we can see kind of a different pattern emerge of where we didn't have any raccoon pictures up in Stoddard, Washington, Hillsborough area, but had quite a few around the Hancock area, and less near, say, Fitzwilliam and down in Sharon. And so how do we use these pictures to estimate density? Well, looking at this picture of the raccoon, in front of every camera, we had this kind of detection zone where we marked this in front of the camera with sticks, rocks, anything we can kind of find and mark this when looking at the pictures. And we actually use the number of times an animal enters this zone and how long it stays to estimate the density of that species. And so given all these pictures we've collected, as I mentioned, we did a pilot study in the southeastern part of the state to estimate density of a few species, and I'll kind of present the results of those to show how this information will be used long term. So this figure will have each species listed as well as the relative density and the number of individuals per square kilometer, which is kind of maybe obscure for some, but is kind of how traditionally these density estimates have been reported in the past. And so we found red fox and the coyotes were the most abundant of the species we were looking at, about 0.3 red foxes per square kilometer, 0.25 coyotes, whereas bobcat and fisher were lower density, 0.05 and 0.03. But these values are actually pretty consistent, would have been found in the literature using other methods, marker capture, and using territory mapping. And you notice the confidence intervals on the red fox are pretty large, and this is because of the 75 cameras we had out, we only detected them at 3. So we're really it wasn't enough data for our model to be very precise about where they were. And so it'll be interesting moving forward, will this happen for a lot of species, just the rare species? And as I mentioned, the differences in distribution of the number of pictures and encounters between cameras is useful to us because it allows us to map how these species are across the landscape, given that there are differences at each camera. And so we can look at density as a function of different habitat variables, and these are just some of the ones we are thinking of using on the right to kind of map those relationships then across the landscape. So these maps aren't exactly comparable to each other because they're on different scales, but generally blue areas are lower density and red areas are higher density. And for example, the red fox we found, density was higher near agricultural areas and lower with higher road density. And kind of takeaway messages from these maps is just the heterogeneity of density across the landscape and how it's not uniform but can vary based on different habitat features. And so we can kind of use this information hopefully to help guide landowners and regional planners. The Monadnock region, I believe, lost about 2% of its forests in the last 15 years, so maybe this information will be useful for land conservation planning as just another tool to be able to identify parcels to be protected and look at other things such as habitat connectivity. We'd love to collaborate with if anyone's doing kind of looking at hotspot analysis of where road mortalities occur. And it can also be interested in collaborating with people that are, say, doing amphibian reptile work, because some of these carnivores are nest predators of those species, and this information might be useful when looking at survival. And also another great thing about the cameras is that we can use this, we're collecting data on other species such as moose and bear and turkey in the area, so we'll be able to analyze those species as well and look at how they occur. We did get, moose mostly in that Hillsborough Stoddard cameras, but not anywhere else, whereas bears were pretty widely distributed, as you might expect. So our hope is to kind of have this information over 3 years to compare with the trapping data, but also at the end create some kinds of tools that will be useful to conservation commissions, cooperative extension foresters, to really help guide conservation in the area. And with that, I want to thank our funders, Fish and Game, Agricultural Experiment Station at UNH, and this wouldn't be possible without the landowners who allowed us to access and set up cameras on their sites. Statewide, we work with 37 landowners from conservation commissions, NGOs, federal partners, state partners. And really the biggest shout out to our team of undergraduates who have looked through over 600,000 pictures so far. There was about, I believe, 150,000 just from this region alone. And they've also gone out to check cameras for us. And we really couldn't do it without them. So with that, I'll take any questions. Yeah.
Have you thought about using landowners, sort of community science? Some of us have wildlife cameras out on our property and could help with this.
Yeah, we have a little bit, if we, especially specific to the area, I think it would be great to have this kind of Monadnock wildlife monitoring network where we can collaborate with, landowners and local agencies, or, say Monadnock Conservancy has a lot of cameras on their property, collaborating with them to kind of get more detail of what's going on in the region.
Are you looking primarily at landowners such as land trusts, or are you looking at private landowners as well?
So we were looking at, say, land trust specifically for our cameras to ensure access. If a private landowner allowed us access, but then they sold their place and the next landowner didn't want us to access it, it would, kind of hurt the continuity of our study. So, it kind of depends on the local landowner itself. Sure. Yeah, so we.
I'm just gonna repeat the question.
Sure.
Wondering how the arrays were chosen. Yes?
Yeah, so we started with a 10 by 10 kilometer grid of cells over the whole state. And for different regions, we categorized some of the cells based on what we thought might be the strongest influence on these species. So in the northern part of the state, it's timber harvest. In the White Mountains, it's elevation. In this region, it's forest cover. And we categorized these into high, medium, low, and then randomly picked a cell that was high, medium, low, trying to ensure that there was one within each wildlife management unit. And then within that cell, the cameras were placed in high, medium, low as well. So we try to keep it random so that we weren't biasing our results in any way, but also having these arrays allow us to get out and check most of those cameras in one day to make it logistically easier. Great question.
Yes, Tom.
What organization he's with, and the previous presenter had a self-reporting mechanism at their website. To follow up to your question, are they only going to study with their own game groups?
Okay. Tom wanted to know what organization you're affiliated with, and also the previous speaker talked about self-reporting and wondered if that was something that could be part of this study.
Yeah, so I'm with the University of New Hampshire in the Natural Resources Department. I'm a PhD student. And so far, we're just using our own cameras. We haven't really ventured into the community science part of thing, but that might be something we could explore in the future.
I've just been asked to remind anyone on Zoom that they can use the Q&A feature to ask questions, and just so that we get all the questions that are coming our way.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering about how do you handle a static camera and the formulation that you use to calculate density very quickly to save one animal over and over and over again.
So,
10 different bobcats, it's the same guy every time.
so the question is, how do you handle knowing whether it's one individual going through the same area or multiple individuals? And how you determine density based on that?
Yeah, great question. And so kind of their formulation we're using is built for when you can't identify an individual. And, that's great for a lot of these species where they don't have markings that indicate, they're not like a leopard or something where you can identify from their spots. And they're built for this need to be able to work without identifying whether it's the same individual. So, probably like something like squirrels, where you have this one individual that likes to sit in front of your camera and go through with like a spruce cone. They're widespread enough that oftentimes it's okay if you had the same individual come in front of it again. So that's, okay if, and because it just works with the number of times it comes in front and how long it stays in front of it. So we don't need to know whether it's a different individual or not. And I don't know if that answers that, but I can talk to you during the break or during lunch. Thanks.